One of the things that I wanted to begin to explore is your connection between the psychological and the physical. And, well, really there's kind of three elements to it. There's the psychological, the physical, and the outside world. In some respects, when you're acting on camera, your face is the stage. Does that make sense? Your face is your stage on camera. And I want you to begin to think of your face almost like the surface of a lake. Sometimes there are things that are happening underneath the surface of the lake that will cause, those inner movements underneath the surface will cause a ripple on the surface of the lake. And then sometimes there are things that come in from the outside world that will cause a ricochet or a splash or some kind of ripple. But sometimes the movement can be very subtle, and sometimes it can be very powerful and very big. What I've been noticing a bit, and I was working with a few actors today doing privates, and it was a note that I found myself giving a few times, was I keep finding that actors are really good at playing their action on the line. Like they're very good at doing their acting when they're speaking. Sometimes there's something missing in their listening. It's not that they're not listening. They are listening. But they keep waiting for their cue. Do you know what I mean? They're waiting for the next line. Because then it's their opportunity to do the next action or the next, or to deliver that next piece of dialogue. If you think of a breath, there are kind of two primary actions to a breath. There's the in-breath and there's the out-breath that move in different directions. But there's also this transitional period. There's the transition that happens at the top of the breath as it transitions from an in-breath to an out. And then there's the transition at the end of the breath from an out-breath to an in. It's those transitions that make you so compelling to watch. And I think it's actors that know how to create those kinds of transitional moments on camera. I think the ability to have those transitions is really the mark of a movie star. Do you know what I mean? Like it draws the audience in. We can see that there's something happening that's very subtle sometimes on the face. The slower a transition is, the more emotional it will feel. The faster the transition, the more it turns into comedy. In fact, comedic transitions can happen on a dime, right? The turn can happen like that. You know, if you think about the breath, right? Like sometimes the breath can be slow, and we might even hold before we transition into the out breath, or sometimes the breath can be quick and the transition is really fast. But between stimulus and response, there is a space. And I want you guys to start to get interested in that space. What are you thinking about? What are you feeling? You know, we've talked previously about the idea of having character thoughts instead of having actor thoughts. Actor thoughts are thoughts like, what's my eye line? You know, can the camera see me? Am I getting the scene right? What does the director think? What does the class think? That's not what the character's thinking about, though. They're thinking about what's just been said to them. They're thinking about the situation they're in. They're thinking about what to do next. How are they going to get out of this? How are they going to solve the problem right now? And they've got feelings about what's being said to them. What is an opinion but like a really strong feeling about something. And you've all got opinions. I could say individual words to you. I could just suggest something to you and you would all have an opinion about it. You'd all have a feeling about it. That stimulus is coming from the outside world. It's coming in. It's swirling something up. And then it's being reflected out in all manners of like subtle, simple ways. And sometimes, or sometimes I might say something else. I could say something really offensive and it would trigger a much bigger response, a much bigger reaction. I want you to find those transitions. Sometimes you might get, I know we've talked about this before, but sometimes you might get two lines of dialogue, like it's still your line, right? And you've got these two lines of dialogue that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. And what I sometimes see is actors playing those two different actions, but there's no bridge between the two of them. Do you know what I mean? It just feels like lines of dialogue because there's no bridge, there's no transitional bridge. Something very simple you can do in order to bridge that gap is to give yourself a transitional thought. You could actually think about what's the line of dialogue that the writer has left out. That if I were to put it in, if I were to just think that thought, almost like it was a line of dialogue, it would take me from that thought to that thought, or that line to that line. Does that make sense? I've used that example before of like if I said, maybe I'm playing a husband who says to his wife, "Do you want some toast?" And my next line is, "I want a divorce." They're both my lines of dialogue. How do I go from "Do you want some toast" to "I want a divorce"? Well, what might be the line of dialogue that the writer's left out? Maybe it's something along the lines of, "Do you want some toast?" You know what? I am so sick and tired of you not answering me. I want a divorce. And now if I just let myself think that thought, do you want some toast? I want a divorce. Can we feel how it has bridged the gap? Just let yourself think it. We've talked about with the emotional energy work too, that just transitioning from one emotional energy to the other will often give you that transition. And it's so interesting to watch. The camera eats it up. Like if I just let myself breathe from one emotional energy, like let's say the energy is aggression. And I lean into that forward energy. And then very gradually I let the energy transition into grief. Or into happiness, which might be tinged with grief. You know what I mean? It can be very subtle. Or sometimes it can be really, as I said, it could be fast, right? Someone was talking about, I think we might have even posted something about, maybe it wasn't us that posted it, I don't know. I think I saw Jeff Daniels talking about a similar idea, right? Like that you can telegraph a lot. I've said this before. Sometimes the audience doesn't hear what a character has said until they see somebody else hear it. Does that make sense? They need to see another character react to what's been said in order to understand the importance of what's just been said. It's letting it land, taking the hit of what's been said. So, I think Jeff Daniels was saying that sometimes, just showing it, like a simple transition might be like to indicate that something has registered, might be as simple as like maybe 1 minute you're smiling and you just let the smile drop. Or it could be a slow drop, right? I mean, if it was a slower drop. So the faster it is, the more it turns into something comic, and the slower it is, the more it's something dramatic. And of course, there's always the stop. The stop, which is a great way of playing surprise, of actually hearing what someone's just said and letting it stop you in your tracks, like a record scratch. So that's the thing tonight I'm curious about you guys experimenting with. Now, maybe not every scene is necessarily going to require that, but just start to become aware of it. One of the things I might even have you practice as you're running your lines, even just before you run your lines, is if you get like a piece of paper, scrunch it up into a ball, and just see what happens if you practice giving the ball, receiving the ball, and the changeover. From giving and receive, like from giving, there's a changeover to receiving, there's a changeover from receiving to giving. It's like if I was throwing the ball, right? There's throwing, there's catching, and there's preparing to throw again. Because we are both the sender and the receiver of communication. And if I'm sending, my responsibility is to make sure what I'm saying lands, to make sure it was received. And if I'm receiving, then my responsibility is to make sure that it landed. Or as I know Scott Williams talks about, the pinch and the ouch. Sometimes you're doing the pinching, sometimes you're doing the ouching. But we want to see both. Transitional thoughts, I think you only need to plan if you're not used to having them. I think, like anything, the more you practice something, the more second nature it becomes. And so if you're a really great actor, you don't need to plan those transitional thoughts. They'll just happen because you're in the moment. You're embodying the point of view of the character. And so I don't need to plan it. I'm that guy right now. So of course it's obvious that I would have a thought about that. Or just like in life, you don't just stand there staring at somebody waiting. Like, I mean, you might if you're waiting for a response, but even then you've got thoughts about, like, why are you not speaking? Do you know what I mean? You're not just waiting for a cue. But I see actors doing that a lot, waiting for a cue or just playing their line. So yes, you can plan it, especially if it's not something you're used to doing. The other thing I just say about planning that we've talked a little bit about is, yes, of course, sometimes you're going to come into a scene and you're going to have your idea of how that scene's going to go. I think what's really important when you are kind of fixed on an idea of how the scene should go is do something at the start of the take to knock you off balance. Knock it off balance and just see what happens. Some of those ideas might still make it in there, but they're not going to come off like ideas. You're going to be scrambling in a really exciting way because it's going to put you back into the moment and out of your idea of how this was supposed to go or should go. Make sense? So knock yourself off balance. And the one other thing I'd just say about that, I read a really interesting article about Ryan Gosling the other day and his approach, part of what he was talking about in his approach to acting. His approach to acting is almost like an escape room, that he's in an escape room and he's trying to figure out how to get out. Like he's constantly in the moment strategizing, trying to work out how to deal with the situation, and anything that might happen, including mistakes that are happening on set, it's all in. It all becomes part of what he now has to deal with in order to navigate that escape room. I thought that was incredible. I thought that was a really interesting idea. You know what I mean? Like, you're constantly trying to solve the problem from the character's point of view. It is a balancing act, and I've definitely had that experience where I'm like, oh, okay, okay, that was too much, and that was nothing at all. And, in actual fact, Bruce Willis talked about how he began to experiment in every film he did with just how little he could do. And he said he eventually went, okay, that was too far. Like, okay, that was nothing at all. That, sometimes nothing, like, less is not more. Sometimes less is less. So you're right, I think a lot of it can depend on the size of the frame. If the frame is right up in here, the subtlest thought can register. But if it's back here, then you might want to just let it be a little bit more pronounced. And if you're in a wide shot, then you can get the whole body involved. But the other thing I would say is, if you're getting the note about, like, your listening is too active, or you're sort of too indicative, like you're indicating, again, you're trying to show your point of view rather than just having your point of view or just knowing your point of view. You know your point of view on things. I could see it. When I said some of those words before, I could see a reaction on your face, and you didn't need to do much. Were you thinking about it? Or were you thinking about what's my face doing? It comes back to that idea again about actors getting too concerned with how they're being seen, not concerned enough with, you weren't thinking about that. You were just looking at me and listening to me. So instead of getting concerned with how you look, get concerned with, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? Get interested in that. The other final thing I'll just say, might even talk about this in more detail another time, but there's a great Michael Chekhov idea that I think speaks to that ability. We talk about that Chekhov quote about inner burn, outer ease. That the character has this inner burn. Where do we see the burn? In the eyes. While the face has this mask of ease. There's another Chekhov idea, which is the ability to radiate and receive. That if I'm radiating, I don't need to do much, do I, to radiate? Like, if you think of a heater, you don't necessarily see that. You don't see it, right? But you feel it. The heater radiates with its heat. You can radiate with your intention, or you can radiate with your opinion, or with your feeling. Does that make sense? And sometimes you can turn it up, and sometimes it can be very subtle. It's still the same energy, it's just varying levels of it. And I really like this idea of receiving. If I'm receiving, there's not much I need to do to receive. In fact, I don't have to show you that I'm receiving. The receiving happens back here. Do you know what I mean? It's that idea that we've also been sort of talking about in class of kind of sitting back and bringing it all into me. So I don't have to push out to you. I'm going to let my scene partner come into me. Like, my eyes can see Justin right now. He's over there, but the image of Justin is back here in my mind. It's actually right here in my optic nerve. So I don't have to push out to Justin. He can just be back here with me. And in fact, I can bring all of you into that space with me, and I don't have to pretend like I can't see everything else. It can all just exist back here with me. That's a really great idea and a really good kind of distinction for not pushing, for letting the camera, having it, drawing it in, draw it into you. Now, sometimes it might be necessary to push out if there's something that I need to say or do, but there's also a lot of power that happens when I just bring you back. And even if I'm in, let's say, aggression, which is a forward energy, it can be very big and it can be very loud and aggressive, but it can also just be here. The intention can just be here. And maybe I don't need to do much. I could even whisper. But you feel it. You can feel an intention, can't you? Somebody looks at you across a room, you can feel their intention towards you.